You're a fool, Rafila. That cabin is a coffin of rotting pine on a worthless ridge. Alderano Paltrinieri sneered, the polished silver of his Colt catching the harsh Colorado sun. He tossed the deed into the dirt. Raquel Hangrave laughed, a sound like scraping iron. Let the little pioneer freeze. She won't last the week. Rafila Ambrozuich didn't flinch. She picked up the smudged paper, her knuckles white. I paid your price, Alderano. It's mine now. She turned her back on their cruelty, stepping toward the unforgiving San Juan Mountains. The year was 1888, and Telluride, Colorado, was a town built on the bones of desperate dreamers and the overflowing pockets of ruthless men. Alderano Paltrinieri was the latter, a land baron and banker who wore three-piece wool suits that never seemed to catch the omnipresent mining dust. Beside him always stood Raquel Hangrave, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and dangerous as the hunting knife strapped to her thigh. They owned the town, they owned the law, and until an hour ago, they had owned the dilapidated shack on Dead Man's Ridge. Rafila Ambrozuich walked away from the bank, the deed burning a hole in her woolen coat. She had spent every cent she had inherited from her late father, a Polish immigrant who had broken his back on the railroads, to buy this land. Alderano had sold it to her for a fraction of what land in the valley cost, mocking her all the while. Everyone in Telluride knew the ridge was barren. No gold, no silver, no timber worth cutting. Just sheer drops, howling winds, and the ghostly remnants of past failures. But Rafila didn't want a fortune. She wanted isolation. She wanted a place where the suffocating smog of the city and the crushing weight of her grief couldn't reach her. The journey up the mountain took 4 grueling hours. She led a borrowed, sway-backed mule, loaded with her meager supplies. A 50-pound sack of flour, a tin of Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee, a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven, and her father's rusted Winchester Model 1873 rifle. The air grew thinner and colder with every step, the scent of pine needles replacing the stench of horse manure and cheap whiskey from the town below. When she finally crested the ridge, the cabin came into view. Alderano hadn't been exaggerating when he called it a coffin. It sagged dangerously to the left, its log walls gray and splintering like the ribs of a rotting carcass. The roof, patched with rusted tin and decaying sod, looked ready to cave in under the first heavy snowfall. It sat precariously close to the edge of a jagged ravine, the wind whistling through the chinks in the logs with a sound like a dying man's wheeze. Rafila tied the mule to a sturdy spruce and pushed open the front door. It shrieked on rusted hinges, revealing a single, shadowed room smelling of mildew and animal droppings. The floorboards were warped, and a crude stone fireplace dominated the far wall, choked with years of debris. A lesser woman would have sat down in the dust and wept, but Rafila had crossed an ocean in the belly of a steamer and buried her father in frozen earth. She didn't have the luxury of tears. She rolled up her sleeves, grabbed a makeshift broom of pine boughs, and went to work. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, turning the mountain air into a physical assault. Rafila managed to get a meager fire going in the hearth, the smoke stinging her eyes before finally finding the chimney draft. She huddled under 2 heavy wool blankets, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of black, bitter Arbuckle's coffee. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the single glass pane in the window. She was alone. She was freezing, but as she looked at the dancing flames, a flicker of defiance sparked in her chest. Alderano Paltrinieri and Raquel Hangrave had sold her a death sentence, fully expecting her to crawl back to Telluride begging for a ticket east. She would rather let the San Juan Mountains claim her bones than give them the satisfaction. She had a home now, pathetic as it was, and she would defend it. The morning sun broke over the jagged peaks like a shattered yoke, spilling pale, freezing light across the ridge. Rafila awoke to a cabin so cold her breath plumed in thick, white clouds. The water in her tin basin had frozen solid overnight. Shivering violently, she threw another log on the dying embers and began the arduous task of preparing a meager breakfast of hardtack and beans. She was outside, chopping firewood with hands that felt like blocks of wood, when she heard the crunch of hooves on the frost-hardened trail. Raffala dropped the axe and instinctively reached for the Winchester, leaning against the cabin wall. A lone rider emerged from the timberline. He sat tall in the saddle of a spotted Appaloosa, wearing a battered Stetson and a thick buffalo hide coat. He didn't look like one of Alderano's thugs. As he drew closer, he raised a gloved hand in a peaceful gesture. "Easy there, miss," the man called out, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried over the wind. "I ain't looking for trouble. Saw the smoke from your chimney. Didn't think anyone was crazy enough to move up here." Raffala kept her hand near the rifle. "Who are you?" "Alphonse Linden," he said, tipping his hat. He had a weathered face, lined with years of sun and hardship, but his pale blue eyes were kind. "I run a small spread down in the lower valley. Thought I'd ride up and see if whoever bought this old shack was still breathing after last night's freeze." Raffala relaxed her grip slightly. "I'm breathing. Barely. Raffala Ambrozewicz." Alphonse dismounted, tying his horse to a post. He eyed the sagging cabin, shaking his head. "Paltrinieri sold you this, didn't he? That snake would sell his own mother a leaky boat. This is the old Treccani claim." "Treccani?" Raffala asked, handing Alphonse a cup of freshly boiled coffee. "Emanuele Treccani," Alphonse said, wrapping his thick hands around the tin. "An old Italian prospector. Came up here about 5 years ago. He was convinced there was a motherlode of silver beneath this ridge. Everyone called him crazy. Paltrinieri laughed him out of the bank when he asked for a loan. Then, one winter, Emanuele just vanished, left all his gear. Folks figured he fell down the ravine or froze to death. Paltrinieri claimed the land for unpaid taxes a month later." Raffala looked at the warped floorboards beneath her feet. The thought of a dead man's ghost haunting the shack sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "You need help patching this roof, or the next blizzard will bury you," Alphonse said, setting his cup down. "I've got some spare lumber and tar paper down at my place. I can bring it up tomorrow." "I don't have money to pay you, Mr. Linden," Raffala said proudly. "Call me Alphonse. And I ain't asking for money. Out here we survive by helping our neighbors, even the ones living on cursed ridges." True to his word, Alphonse returned the next day. Together, they spent a grueling week reinforcing the roof, chinking the log walls with mud and dried grass, and repairing the warped floor. It was during the floor repairs, pulling up a particularly rotten board near the fireplace, that Raffala found it. It wasn't dirt beneath the floorboards. It was a heavy, iron trapdoor, completely flush with the foundation stones. It had a massive, rusted keyhole and a thick iron pull ring. Alphonse wiped the sweat from his brow, staring down at the heavy metal. "Well, I'll be damned. Emanuele must have dug a cellar. Never knew about this." Raffala grabbed the iron ring and pulled with all her might. It didn't budge a millimeter. It was locked tight, the mechanism seized by years of rust and neglect. She looked at Alphonse, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I need to get down there," she whispered. "You'll need more than elbow grease to break that," Alphonse said, kicking the iron with his boot. "That's a bank vault-grade lock." Emanuele was hiding something he didn't want Paltrinieri to find. The discovery of the locked door consumed Raffala. For 2 agonizing days, she chipped away at the edges with the backside of her father's felling axe. The mountain cold seeped through her boots as she worked, her breath hissing out in pale clouds of exertion. She managed only to splinter the hickory axe handle and batter her knuckles until they were a mottled, bruised purple. The iron door remained resolute, an unyielding sentinel, guarding its secrets in the cold dark beneath the floorboards. She needed proper tools, heavy, unforgiving tools. Leaving the cabin secured as best she could, she made the long, treacherous trek back down into Telluride. The wind bit through her woolen coat, and knee-deep snowdrifts threatened to swallow her at every turn. When she finally reached the valley floor, the town felt just as hostile as the elements. Telluride was a place of loud saloons, muddy thoroughfares, and eyes that constantly weighed your worth in silver. She kept her head down, avoiding the grand brick facade of Paltrinieri's Bank, where the town's elite sipped imported bourbon, and made her way to the general store at the end of the street. The store was a chaotic haven smelling of cinnamon, oiled leather, and black powder. It was owned by Erica Gard, a formidable, square-jawed woman who also served as the town's unofficial magistrate when the corrupt sheriff was too drunk or too bribed to care. Erica stood behind the polished oak counter, a Colt peacemaker strapped conspicuously over her apron, weighing out flour for a miner. "Rafila Ambrosowicz," Erica said, her sharp eyes narrowing as the miner scurried out. She took in Rafila's wind-chapped face, hollowed cheeks, and the dried blood cracking on her knuckles. "I heard you were up on Dead Man's Ridge. I'm surprised you haven't frozen solid or blown off the cliff." "I need a forged crowbar," Rafila said, her voice hoarse. She reached into her pocket and placed 3 of her final silver coins on the counter and a sledgehammer. "The heaviest, meanest piece of iron you have in this shop." Erica raised an eyebrow, leaning over the counter. "Trying to break rocks up there? There's nothing on that ridge but misery and ghost stories, honey. Paltrinieri made sure of that before he sold it to you." "I have a stubborn door," Rafila replied evasively, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. Erica's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her hardened features. She reached beneath the counter and hauled up a massive 5-foot iron crowbar and an 8-pound sledgehammer, dropping them onto the wood with a loud clatter. "Listen to me carefully, Rafila. Emanuele Treccani wasn't just crazy. The man was deeply paranoid. If he took the time to lock a door up on that god-forsaken ridge, he locked it for a reason. And if Alderano catches wind that you're digging around his old haunts, well, Alderano doesn't like surprises. He likes things buried. Alderano sold me the land. What's underneath it is mine," Rafila said, grabbing the heavy tools. Erica sighed, ringing up the sail and sliding the coins into her till. "Just keep your rifle loaded and your eyes on the tree line. Raquel Heingreve was in here yesterday asking if anyone had seen you. She seemed downright disappointed you hadn't come back down in a pine box." The journey back up the mountain was agonizing. The added weight of the iron tools dragged at Rafila's weary shoulders, but pure, unadulterated adrenaline fueled her steps. The humiliation from Alderano, the condescension of the town, the biting cold, she used it all to keep her boots moving forward. When she reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the warped floorboards. The wind began its nightly howl, rattling the tin roof. She didn't wait for morning. She lit 3 kerosene lanterns, positioning them in a tight circle around the trapdoor so the yellow light pooled on the rusted lock. She wedged the sharp, flattened end of the crowbar beneath the thick lip of the iron door, right next to the seized mechanism. Stepping back, she hoisted the heavy sledgehammer. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she brought the iron head down on the crowbar with a deafening clang. Sparks showered in the dim light, momentarily blinding her. The sheer impact rattled her teeth in her skull and sent violent vibrations up her arms. She adjusted her grip and swung again and again. The small cabin echoed with the violent, rhythmic song of iron striking iron. Her blistered hands tore open, bleeding onto the wooden handle of the hammer, making it slick, but she refused to stop. She swung for her father. She swung for the cold. She swung for Alderano's sneer. Finally, on the 30th brutal strike, a loud crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. The rusted internal tumblers of the vault lock shattered, spewing metal fragments across the floor. Panting heavily, sweat stinging her eyes despite the freezing air, Rafila dropped the sledgehammer. She grabbed the crowbar with both hands and threw her entire body weight backward. The heavy iron door groaned, screaming against hinges that hadn't moved in half a decade, and slowly levered upward. A wave of trapped air rushed out from the darkness below, blowing back her hair. It didn't smell of simple dirt or rot. It smelled intensely metallic. It smelled like damp sulfur, old, decaying paper, and the distinct, sharp scent of gunpowder. Rafila grabbed a lantern, her bloody hand trembling around the wire handle, and lowered the light into the void. The lantern light spilled weakly down a narrow, treacherous set of stairs. These weren't built from wood. They were violently hewn directly into the mountain's bedrock, the stone bearing the deep, frantic gouges of a pickaxe. Rafila descended slowly, the Winchester slung over her shoulder, testing each slick step before applying her weight. The air grew colder, denser, and impossibly silent with every foot she descended, as if the earth itself was swallowing the noise of the howling wind above. At the bottom of the stairs, the claustrophobic passage opened into a remarkably large, reinforced chamber. Rafila held the lantern high, her breath catching in her throat. Emanuel Treccani hadn't just dug a cellar. He had excavated a hidden subterranean fortress. Massive, foot-thick timber beams supported the ceiling, holding back the crushing weight of the ridge. The scale of the labor required for one man to build this in secret was staggering. The room was meticulously, almost obsessively organized. Against the left wall sat stacked rows of heavy wooden crates stamped with faded Denver mining logos. They were packed tight with bundles of dynamite, coils of fuse wire, blasting caps, and a rack of sharpened pickaxes. On the right, a makeshift desk fashioned from rough sawn planks laid across two empty whiskey barrels held a rusted tin cup, a dried-out inkwell, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. But it was the back wall that made Rafila freeze in place. The bedrock there had been violently chipped away in a massive, sprawling arc. In the flickering, yellow lamplight, a jagged vein of raw, unrefined ore glittered furiously. It wasn't a small pocket or a mere dusting. It was a massive artery of pure, undeniable silver, thick as a man's torso, plunging deep into the heart of the mountain. It looked like a frozen lightning bolt trapped in the stone. Emanuel hadn't been a delusional fool. He had found the mother lode, right beneath the very ridge Alderano Paltrinieri had dismissed as barren. Rafila walked toward the desk, her boots echoing sharply in the silent chamber, the sheer magnitude of the wealth pressing down on her. Next to the ledger sat a heavy, cast-iron Mosler safe. It was a small model, but it looked incredibly sturdy. However, upon closer inspection, she saw the dial had been frantically smashed with a hammer, and the heavy door hung slightly ajar on warped hinges. She pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against the damp, were thick bundles of legal documents. She pulled them out, laid them on the makeshift desk, and opened the leather ledger, spreading the papers out in the lantern light. The handwriting in the ledger was frantic, the ink pressed so hard it nearly tore the pages. It was written in a chaotic mix of sharp, sloping Italian and broken English. Rafila traced the desperate scrawl with her dirt-stained finger, piecing together the final, terrifying days of Emanuel Treccani. The 14th of October, 1883. Paltrinieri knows. He sent that witch, Raquel, to follow me up the trail. She thinks she is a shadow, but I hear her spurs. I have found the heart of the mountain, the Silver River, but I cannot register the claim. Paltrinieri owns the claims office. He owns the sheriff. If I reveal this wealth, he will simply kill me and take it as abandoned property. I must dig deeper. I must hide it. Rafila flipped the page, a profound chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the subterranean air. The handwriting on the next entry was shaky, the ink blotted, as if the writer had been trembling violently. November 2nd. I am dying. Raquel visited my camp down in the lower valley yesterday. She brought a bottle of sweet wine, a peace offering from the bank. She smiled with her dead eyes. I was a fool to drink. My stomach burns like hellfire. I cannot keep water down. Arsenic. I know the taste of it from the copper mines. I have crawled up to the bunker. I am too weak to walk back to town. I will lock the heavy door from the inside. They will not get my silver. I leave my curse upon this ridge. Rafila stared at the page, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. The rumors in town were wrong. Emanuel hadn't frozen to death and he hadn't fallen down a ravine. Raquel Hongrev had murdered him in cold blood, and Paltrinieri had undoubtedly orchestrated the whole thing to seize the land once Emanuel failed to pay his taxes. Shaking, she turned her attention to the legal documents wrapped in the oilcloth. She expected to find mining surveys or letters to family. Instead, her eyes widened as she read the heavy, embossed seals. They weren't just land deeds for Dead Man's Ridge. They were the original, undoctored homestead deeds to the entire lower valley, the fertile land that Alphonse Linden and a dozen other hard-working ranchers currently lived on. It clicked instantly. Paltrinieri had been forging documents at his bank to steal their land from beneath them, building his empire on fraudulent paper. Emanuel, perhaps in a fit of righteous revenge or seeking leverage, had somehow stolen the real documents from the bank's vault and locked them down here. Emanuel hadn't just left behind a fortune in raw silver. He had left behind the rope needed to hang Alderano Paltrinieri in a federal court. Suddenly, a sound cut through the absolute silence of the bunker. The floorboards above her head creaked beneath a heavy, deliberate weight. Rafila froze, the lantern flickering slightly as her breath hitched. The wind outside was a constant roar, but this was distinct. Footsteps. Someone was inside the cabin. Moving with practiced silence, she grabbed the Winchester from her shoulder and immediately blew out the lantern flame, plunging the underground chamber into absolute, suffocating darkness. She crept toward the bottom of the stone stairs, her back pressed against the cold rock wall, listening intently. "I told you I smelled fresh wood smoke, Alderano," a woman's voice drifted down from the open trapdoor. It was smooth, cruel, and unmistakable. "Raquel Hongrev. The little rat isn't dead. She's been fixing the place up. Find her," came the polished, venomous voice of Paltrinieri, echoing off the cabin walls. "And when you do, put a bullet in her head and throw her body in the ravine. I want this ridge cleared and sanitized by nightfall. I have a buyer from the Denver Syndicate arriving tomorrow, and I will not have my negotiations complicated by a squatter." Rafila gripped the stock of the rifle, her heart pounding a desperate, deafening rhythm against her ribs. The predators had returned to the scene of their crime, fully intending to commit another. But as she stood in the dark, her finger curling around the cold iron of the trigger, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, burning fury. They didn't know the prey had found teeth of her own. Up in the cabin, the heavy boots of Alderano and Raquel thudded against the newly repaired floorboards. "Look at this," Alderano scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "She actually tried to patch the chinks, like putting a bandage on a corpse." "She's not here," Raquel said, the metallic click of her drawing her Colt echoing in the small room. "Maybe she went hunting, or maybe she fell off the ridge. Good riddance." "Don't be careless, Raquel," Alderano snapped. "I want to see a body. The Denver Syndicate is paying top dollar for this entire stretch of the mountain, including this ridge. They want to build a resort. If some immigrant squatter pops up claiming she has a deed, it complicates my negotiations." Down in the dark bunker, Rafila leveled her Winchester toward the square of dim light at the top of the stairs. Her hands, battered from breaking the lock, were remarkably steady. She had the silver. She had the proof of their murders and thefts. She just had to survive long enough to get it to Erica Gard in Telluride. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the open trapdoor. Raquel was standing right at the edge, peering down. "Alderano," Raquel hissed, her voice suddenly tight. "The floor is open. There's a set of stairs going down." Silence hung heavy in the cabin. Rafila held her breath, her finger curling around the cold iron of the trigger. "Emanuel," Alderano breathed, his voice laced with sudden realization and greed. The crazy old bastard actually dug a hole. "Get a lantern, Raquel. We're going down." Just as Raquel turned to find a lamp, the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence outside the cabin, followed by the sound of shattering glass as the cabin's only window blew inward. Paltrinieri, Alphonse Linden's voice roared from the tree line outside. "Step away from that cabin and drop your irons. I saw your horses. You got no business up here." "Linden," Alderano snarled, diving behind the heavy oak table Rafila had salvaged. "That meddling dirt farmer. Raquel, handle him." Raquel moved with terrifying speed, crouching below the shattered window and firing 3 blind shots from her Colt into the timberline. The heavy thud of Alphonse's return fire chewed into the exterior logs of the cabin. A chaotic shootout erupted. This was her chance. Rafila didn't wait. She struck a match against the stone wall, the sudden flare blinding her for a second, and lit the kerosene lantern. She grabbed the ledger and the stack of stolen deeds, stuffing them into the deep pockets of her heavy coat. She heard Alderano shouting above the gunfire. "Forget the farmer. The squatter must be down in that hole. I'm going in." Boots pounded on the stone stairs. Alderano was coming down, a silver-plated revolver in his hand, his eyes wide with a manic mix of fear and avarice. As he reached the bottom, the lantern light caught the massive vein of silver in the bedrock. He stopped dead, his mouth dropping open, entirely forgetting about the woman with the rifle. "My God," Alderano whispered, walking toward the silver like a man entranced. He found it. "The mother lode. It's all mine." "It belongs to Emmanuel," Rafila said, her voice echoing coldly in the bunker. She stepped out from the shadows of the support timbers, the Winchester aimed squarely at his chest. "And you killed him for it." Alderano spun around, raising his revolver, but Rafila didn't flinch. She had the high ground of morality, and she had the heavier gun. "Put the gun down, Rafila," Alderano sneered, though a bead of sweat rolled down his pristine collar. "You're a penniless immigrant. Shoot me, and my men will hang you from the nearest pine tree. Give me the claim, and I'll give you enough money to buy a mansion in New York." "You don't have enough money to buy back the souls you've stolen," Rafila said, her grip tightening on the Winchester. "I read the ledger, Alderano. I have the deeds to the lower valley. You forged them. You stole Alphonse's land, and Raquel poisoned Emmanuel." Alderano's face paled. The arrogance finally cracked, revealing the desperate, cornered rat beneath. "Give me those papers," he screamed, lunging forward, raising his gun to fire. Rafila didn't shoot to kill. She shot to survive. She pulled the trigger. The heavy, 44 to 40 caliber bullet roared through the confined bunker, striking Alderano in the right shoulder. The impact spun him around like a rag doll, his silver Colt clattering against the stone floor. He collapsed with a shriek of agony, clutching his shattered shoulder, his pristine wool suit rapidly staining crimson. Upstairs, the gunfire abruptly stopped. Heavy footsteps rushed toward the trapdoor. "Alderano!" Raquel yelled, rushing down the stairs. She saw Paltrinieri bleeding on the floor, and Rafila standing over him with the smoking rifle. With a feral scream, Raquel raised her weapon. But Raquel, in her blind rage, didn't look where she was stepping. Emmanuel Trekenai had been paranoid, and his bunker was a fortress designed to protect his silver. He had left one final trap for the people he knew would eventually come for him. Raquel's boot caught a nearly invisible tripwire stretched across the bottom step, a wire connected to one of the crates of ancient, unstable dynamite stacked against the wall. Rafila saw the wire snap. "No!" she screamed, throwing herself backward behind the thickest timber support pillar she could find. A deafening, earth-shattering explosion ripped through the bunker. The concussion wave hit Rafila like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and burying her in a shower of rock dust and splintered wood. The ground heaved violently, the sound of tearing rock echoing like the roar of a dying beast. When the dust finally began to settle, Rafila coughed, her ears ringing a high, continuous pitch. She dragged herself out from behind the pillar. The left side of the bunker had completely collapsed under tons of bedrock and dirt. Raquel Hongrave was gone, buried beneath the mountain she had tried to steal. Alderano Paltrinieri lay trapped under a massive fallen timber, his legs pinned beneath impossible weight. He was alive, coughing up blood and dust, whimpering like a beaten dog. Hard karma had finally caught up to the untouchable Baron of Telluride. Rafila stood, brushing the dirt from her coat. She checked her pockets. The ledger and the deeds were safe. She climbed the debris-strewn stairs to the cabin. The floor was completely destroyed, but the front door was open. Alphonse Linden was standing there, his shoulder bleeding, grazed by a bullet, staring in shock at the smoking crater in the floor. Behind him, riding hard up the ridge, were a half-dozen deputies led by Erica Guard, her peacemaker drawn. They had heard the explosion from the valley. "Rafila," Alphonse gasped, rushing forward to help her. "Are you all right? What in God's name happened down there?" Rafila leaned against the doorframe, taking a deep breath of the freezing, pristine mountain air. She looked at Erica, who was dismounting and staring at the ruins. "I found a locked door," Rafila said, her voice steady and clear. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blood-stained ledger and the stack of deeds, holding them out to the sheriff. "And I found out who really owns this mountain. The reign of Alderano Paltrinieri was over. The valley belonged to its people again. And the ridge, the worthless, cursed ridge, belonged to the woman who had the courage to turn the key. The dust settles, but the lessons of the San Juan Mountains endure." Rafila's journey reminds us that true value isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes, the places and people society discards hold the greatest hidden treasures, waiting only for someone with the courage to turn the key. When arrogance and greed blind us, hard karma inevitably arrives to balance the scales. We must face our own locked doors with bravery, knowing that the darkest storms often precede our greatest breakthroughs. If you found inspiration in Rafila's resilience and this tale of frontier justice, please take a moment to like this video, share it with a friend who loves a great story, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling Western adventures. Your support helps us bring more hidden histories and powerful life lessons to light. Keep exploring the frontier and never underestimate your own inner strength.